now to the very official part. So I have also very great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, who is very suitably talking to us about the nature restoration law, which was the huge landmark legislation and very important to this community and also to the coming years. So I am very happy to introduce Dr. Florian Claeys, who is originally coming from France, but is working in the European Commission as a policy officer responsible for the nature restoration law and its implementation later on. So he is also involved in the biodiversity financing issues in the EU level, and he can open the history and the future of the nature restoration law, how it came to be, and what will happen next. So thank you very much. Florian, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Many thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Quite impressive also to see so many people in front of me. But yeah, it's an honor to start the conference by a deep dive on the nature restoration law. In fact, there is also a bit of personal emotion in this, because the last time I was in a CERE conference was 14 years ago in Avignon. At that time I was a young student, a bachelor student, and I was just finishing my very first internship on ecological restoration in the Bear Lagoon in those part of France, and it was thanks to James here. So I don't know if you were expecting that, James, but 14 years later, here we are. So I see that the title also of the conference was about bridging science, practices and policy of nature restoration. So I hope that it won't take 14 years for all of you to make the bridge. Making bridge can take a lot of time, but when they are built, it stands forever. Another important aspect of this bridging also, that means also that among of you there are some students. Most of you perhaps will become practitioners or researchers on ecological restoration. But some of you will be also decision makers in the near future. And crossing the bridge starts now. So there is a lot of things to do on nature restoration on both sides of science, practice and policy. The presentation I will deliver to you is a long version of the usual presentations that my colleagues and myself are delivering to the colleagues, the other decision makers, the civil society, the companies, but everyone interested in the nature restoration law. But just to mention that it's a collective work. I've decided to keep the first introduction, which is more about the scientific context. I don't think that you will learn anything about that, but I think it was important for you to see a bit how, on the decision-making side, we are mobilizing a bit the scientific evidence that you're producing to start acting. So the first message, of course, is that we are enduring a massive human-induced biodiversity crisis. It is now a common knowledge for everyone, but this common knowledge has been able to be popularized among the world society thanks to the IPBES and the Global Assessment Report that has been produced in 2019. Just to mention, 2019 was also the beginning of the previous commissions that decided to act on the nature restoration law. So by this simple fact, you can already see a first example of bridge between science, practices, and decision-making is through this kind of interface, like the IPBES, that the scientific community, practitioners, can discuss with policymakers and start forging the public action on nature restoration. One of the most popular facts is the huge increase of the extinction rate due to human activities. But of course, there is many other dimensions of biodiversity loss. Europe is not an exception in this international situation, and also in our continent, the state of nature is in growing state. So the second report that I've been framed or have been very important to start the work of the Commission on the Nature Restoration Law has been made by the European Environmental Agency, the State of Nature and the EU. It is mainly based on the reporting made by member states under the Nature Directives, and that highlights a second aspect of the bridge between science practice and policy making, which is about the data collection. And it's through this data that we're able to provide this kind of key messages that will influence a lot the decision makers. Of course, climate change is a rising threat in this context, but not only. There is also continuation of human activities, including agriculture, several land use, urbanization, data and pollution, that are contributing to this biodiversity loss. One figure is that the preservation status of habitat assessment is only good in 14% of the assessment made. And it's a bit the same situation also for the species. All this rising concern, all this negative assessment are happening despite the fact that Natura 2000 sites cover not less than 80% of land and 10% of marine waters in the EU. Now, even if the report made by the EA is not policy prescriptive but only policy relevant, de facto that means that we are not doing enough to reach our biodiversity objective. As said by the Minister and previous intervenants, the biodiversity argument is not the only one in favor of nature restoration. Here it's a collection of other big arguments. First one is on climate. In the last 14 years, the EU has lost more than 1/3 of the natural things. So there is a climate emergency to restore the natural things in the EU. More recently, with the European Climate Risk Assessment, the finding is that there is some critical risks of crop failures or bad harvest, especially in southern Europe. So there is also an agricultural emergency in favor of nature restoration. Last year, 1/3 of the EU rivers experienced at least one day floods that were exceeding the high flood thresholds. So there is also an argument of security of human population in favor of nature restoration. And last but not least, and that's a report made by the European Central Bank, the vast majority of EU companies, of the whole EU economy, is highly dependent of at least one ecosystem service. That means that just not companies, but basically your own financial capital, the retirement payments of your parents or grandparents, but also the savings that you're doing for your children, are highly dependent of nature. And that's also a big argument, so there is a financial emergency to act for nature restoration. So based on these scientific findings and all these society arguments, the only things that was needed to kick off the preparation of the nature restoration law was a political impetus. And it started, under the previous Commission, with the European Green Deal. The majority of people are considering the Green Deal as a milestone for the climate neutrality in the EU. And it's true that it was the first continental-wide commitment to climate neutrality, but it's far beyond than that. You can interpret the European Green Deal as a massive exercise of policy coherence, of silo breaking. And through the European Green Deal, there have been a lot of synergies that have been established among various parts of public action. The protection and the restoration of nature is one of the key parts of the Green Deal. It's only related to the climate neutrality and adaptation, but not only. You have also the elimination of pollution. You have also the agricultural aspect and the strategy from farm to fork. And you have also the financial aspect. So all that means that there is a lot of links between these different leaves of the European Green Deal. So that was the first layer. The second layer for the political mandate of the Commission for the Nature Restoration Law comes with the Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. Compared to the previous ones, the pillar on restoration was far more prominent than in the previous versions. The biodiversity strategy gathers 4 components. There is, of course, some actions on protection for nature, restoration, but there was also some aspects related to the transformative change, so on how to act on the various parts of the society, on other policies to ensure that we can reach our biodiversity objectives. And last but not least, there was also an international component that later became the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I'll come back on that later. In this biodiversity strategy, there have been several key EU commitments that have been highlighted as some lighthouse for actions. So there is this objective of putting managed and current protected areas on 30% of land and seas. There is also the commitment to restore degraded ecosystems. Also some key figures, like restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers in the EU, restoring 10% of the landscape features in our fields, reversing the decline of pollinators, reducing pesticides, and so on. So there is a dashboard that allows you to track the progress made by the Commission in reaching these EU commitments. Still in progress, but yeah, we have managed to complete at least 50 of them. The 50th was indeed the Nature Restoration Law. So based on this political mandate, there have been also several key aspects of the Nature Restoration Law that were proposed in these documents. First, the motivation, that there is a strong need for enforcing large-scale restoration in the EU because of the continuation of this degradation. Protection is not enough also. We need to restore and to reverse the biodiversity loss. But also a constatation that the voluntary targets that were proposed in the previous strategy were not met. So we need to go a bit stronger than just voluntaryship. Some other important aspects were also proposed for designing the EU restoration policy. So it took the legal form of a regulation and not a directive. I know that most of you are aware, I'm quite familiar with the Birds Directive, the Habitats Directive. But considering the level of urgency, we proposed instead to have a regulation which applies directly, so there is no time for transposition. The idea was also to complement and build on the existing policy framework, as we have the chance in the EU to have some good environmental acquis. And you have the various directives that have been used to build the Nature Restoration Law, the habitats, the birds, but also the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and the Water Framework Directive. And coming from the Green Deal, there was also the strong focus on the synergies between climate change and biodiversity. Not only because climate change is a big driver of biodiversity, and in a way biodiversity is a victim of climate change, but also because biodiversity is a strong solution for climate change, and that's all the rationale on nature-based solutions. So the Commission made its proposal 2 years ago, on the 22nd of June. At the same time, it was discussed after, when the Commission made this proposal, then in the EU decision-making process, this proposal is sent to 2 institutions, the Council, which is representing the Member States, and the Parliament, which is representing the citizens. The 2 institutions discussed on their side and tried to improve the Commission proposal, trying to reflect some political balance, to improve the text, to reflect some new concerns. It took around 1 year for each of the institutions to make their own version of the Nature Restoration Law. So last year we were in the situation where there were 3 different versions of the Nature Restoration Law, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, and that we started the phase of the trilogue. Trilogue is the way how co-legislators are discussing together in a way to converge on one single version with a political agreement that was reached in November. I'm highlighting a bit all this legislative process because with the Nature Restoration Law we have learned that each and every step of this process required a full mobilization of the scientific community, of the practitioner community, of the society. Meaning that this political agreement, there were still some steps after that. It has been endorsed by Member States end of November, which means that after the ball goes back to the Parliament for the formal adoption, made this year in February. And then Member States needed a bit of time to be sure that the Nature Restoration Law was needed, was a good text. And it was just after the European elections that the Council, under the Belgian presidency, managed to give its formal approval of the law. At this moment, it's only the formal process. It has been published in July. And as Jordi said it, entered into force 10 days before. So I don't know, Avelina, if you had anticipated this timing, but I can say that organizing the society for this conference only 10 days after the 24th, it's a remarkable sense of the timing. Yeah? So thanks a lot. Last but not least, in this legislative process, there have been also a big milestone achieved at the international level. So this global biodiversity framework, which is also triggers some EU commitments. There is also restoration, both for 2050, it's the first goal, but also directly in 2030 with these targets. And you can see that there is, by 2030, at least 30% of degraded areas that have to be put under effective restoration. I just underlining this aspect, degraded areas, because you will see in the next slide that with the nature restoration law we have different figures, but which is highly consistent with this one. Also to mention that there is some other targets that are relevant for the nature restoration law. So here is a small list, but it's not comprehensive. But yeah, so it's an instrumental way for the EU to commit also to other targets. And there is also some aspect related to monitoring, planning and reporting that will be also important to have your inputs when we will implement the nature restoration law. So now let's take the big stuck and to do a deep dive on the nature restoration law itself. There is various components in this law with some overarching objectives, several restoration targets and obligations, a full implementation framework that we will now start, and also some financing aspects that are important to discuss. So there is several objectives that have been highlighted. The biodiversity one, but also, and that's a reflection coming from the Green Deal and all the facts that I've started the presentation with, that there is contribution to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and land degradation neutrality. There is also an acknowledgement of the importance of nature restoration for food security. And last but not least, the fourth objective is to meet the EU international commitments, especially the global biodiversity framework, but not only. The Paris Agreement is also an important text in this context. The commitment itself translates in a figure, which is 20% of EU lands and seas by 2030. But you can notice that it's not only degraded, but it's all. So you don't have to mix the two. At the international level, it's 30% of degraded areas. In the EU, it's 20% of all land and seas. In fact, it was a convenient way because there is no international agreement on what is the degraded areas. So it was also a good way to initiate the actions immediately by saying that it will cover basically all lands and sea for 20% of them. And by 2030, it's the same objective. The restoration has been defined, perhaps it's not the fully science-based definition that was proposed by Jordi, but at least it refers to the process of actively and passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystem. And then the definition is a bit long because it's making also some references to the various restoration targets and obligations. But what is important is that it is a process. So that the law reflects the fact that restoring an ecosystem can take several decades. But what is important is to start the process as soon as possible. All these general objectives are broken down in various restoration targets and obligations. So the first three ones reflect a bit the existing legislations. So it's mainly relying on the Birds and Habitats Directive as well as the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. But after there have been a full set of new targets, which is very innovative. Targets on urban ecosystems, on rivers, on pollinators, on agroecosystems, on forest ones, as well as additional trees. So I will now describe a bit more each of the targets. And if you have some questions, we will have the whole week to discuss a bit all the details. So for the targets based on existing legislations, there is various targets, especially to improve the conditions for the habitat of Union interest, which are listed in the Annex 1, and it's the same Annex 1 than the Habitats Directive. There is some time-bound targets, which is a real added value compared to the existing nature directives. So 30% by 2030, 60 by 2040, 90 by 2050. That's for improving the conditions of habitats. Starting for 2030 by the Natura 2000 sites. Then there is some targets of re-establishment. Again, 30%, 60%, 100% by 2030, until reaching the favorable reference area. There is also some targets on the habitat species, so to improve the quality, the quantity, the connectivity. All these measures are also to deliver some results, so they have to be effective restoration measures. Jordi said authentic. Well, it's more or less related, meaning that these restoration measures have to ensure continuous improvement in areas. That means that there is also some effort-based obligation of non-deterioration. When you have restored an habitat, or for the habitats that are already in good conditions, there is also an obligation for member states to ensure that there is no deterioration of these habitats, in order to stabilize a bit the restoration baseline. Also in terms of results, member states have to continue their efforts until reaching 90% of habitat area in good conditions, and ensuring increasing trends for the sufficient quality and quantity of habitat of species. So it's not only effort-based obligation, there is also some result one. Following the co-legislation process, there have been various derogation and flexibilities introduced to facilitate the work for member states. So for the very common and widespread habitats, there is a possibility to reduce the objective. For the establishment of habitats, there is also the possibility to reduce if member states don't have any other possibility. Other aspects that have been introduced on the non-deterioration principle, which was something very concerning for member states and the parliament, as there was the fear that it will block the development. So there have been various possibilities introduced for member states to act at the level of the national biogeographical regions instead of only at the site level. Some derogation for force majeure when there is some impact of climate change for projects of overriding public interest. Further derogation for renewable energy projects, because at that time there was also some rising concerns on the renewable energy in Europe. And of course, we cannot forget the current situation. We needed also to introduce some possibilities of exemptions for the defense activities. So that's also a way to highlight that nature restoration is not also against the rest of the society, but working together. Looking at the other objectives, for the urban ecosystems, so there is two different targets. The first one is at the national level is to ensure no net loss of urban green space and then ensure an increasing trend. The second obligation is more at the local level, so the notion of urban ecosystem areas, which can be considered as a set of adjacent local administrative units. So a big city like Brussels could be considered as one urban ecosystem area, for example, pending the decision of member states. But at this level, the obligation is to ensure non-net loss of the urban tree canopy cover and to increase until satisfactory level is reached. Some exceptions have been introduced for the already very green urban ecosystems, as in some cases these exemptions was needed. Regarding the rivers, the obligations are also a bit twofold. The first obligation is to have an inventory of all barriers, all the artificial barriers to the natural connectivity on rivers. So the inventory has to be the most comprehensive possible, no? as much as possible. Then the second obligation is, based on this inventory, to identify the barriers that will need to be removed in order to contribute to various objectives. So first, the restoration of the riparian habitats, that makes the links with the previous target, but also the objectives that were proposed in the biodiversity strategy, so of restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers, and also an aspect on the functionality of floodplains. Next target was about the pollinators. Again, so there is an obligation for member states to improve the pollinators' diversity and to reverse the decline of pollinators' population by 2030, and then thereafter to ensure increasing trends until satisfactory levels are reached. The provisions of the Nature Restoration Law also introduced an obligation of methodology for annual monitoring, which will be one of the work that we have to deliver now. Another big part of the discussions we had with the co-legislators was about agriculture. So there have been a lot of concern expressed on the interplay between nature restoration and agriculture, with some very divergent views. Some were highlighting the fact that nature restoration is contributing to the food security, whereas there were other views that were expressed, highlighting that by letting too much space for nature, we could be in situation of increasing the food risk in the EU. So there have been a lot of discussions between the Parliament with Member States, and at the end we managed to find a compromise which is as follows. So it's an obligation to put in place restoration measures necessary to enhance the biodiversity of agricultural ecosystems, and not only on the protected of the habitats of union interest, but on all the agricultural ecosystems. To ensure that these measures have to be efficient, there is some obligation to achieve increasing trends on 2 of out the 3 indicators, at least 2 of out the 3 of the following one, which is a way to offer some flexibility to member states. So there is a butterfly aspect, the stock of organic carbon, so there is also a link between biodiversity and climate here, and the share with high diversity landscape features. There were also specific targets to enhance the common farmland bird index, because we have some more robust data sets for these indicators. We were in the possibility to propose some specific targets. Then, and that's also another important connection with the climate community, under the agricultural ecosystems, there have been also some time-bound and quantitative targets that have been introduced to put restoration measures on 30%, 40%, 50% by 2030, 40-50, for the dry peatlands under agricultural use. And we have been a bit more specific, meaning that a proportion of these measures have to be also reweighting, as it's the best way to restore dry peatlands for both biodiversity purposes, but also climate purposes, as the dry peatlands are among the most emitting lands contributing to climate change. Several flexibility have been introduced, so the possibility to consider peat extraction sites and other types of dry peatlands, so not only the agricultural use. Some exceptions also for reducing rewetting when there is some arbitrage that has to be made with other policy objectives. And a bit an aspect of implementation, that this objective, especially the rewetting one, has to be based on incentive, not obligation for farmers and the landowners. The idea is really to create some tools so that these actors will be comfortable enough to make the appropriate measures for acting on the restoration of peatlands. And by this way, we were able to keep this important provision in the Nature Restoration Law, because at the moment there was some discussion on whether or not we could keep this part. On the forest ecosystems, well, it's a bit similar to the agricultural ones. There is also an obligation to put in place restoration measures on all the forests, not only on the forest habitats. And to ensure that the restoration measures implemented are effective enough, there is some obligation of achieving increasing trends on various indicators. There is one which is mandatory for all member states, which is the Common Forest Bird Index, again because we have some robust data sets on that. And after there is a choice of 6 out of the 7, so meaning that member states have one joker on indicators. Some of these indicators are really related to the climate aspects, so that's another link to be established, the deal with also. But yeah, these indicators are also some different aspects to reflect the way to capture biodiversity in forest. Some exceptions have been introduced to this article, especially in the case of large-scale force majeure, so especially the wildfires, and also the consideration of the unavailable habitat transformation coming from climate change. Last but not least, and that will be the last part about the restoration targets and obligations, with the support of the Parliament, there have been the possibility to reflect another keystone objective from the biodiversity strategy, which is the planting of 3 billion additional trees. So not, well, the trees, it's not enough to just put one tree. It has to follow several respect, it has to be in full respect of several ecological principles, like this ones. And it's also a way to reflect the importance of the quality of ecological restoration, that it's not, well, not all activities can be considered as restoration measures or contributing to this objective. Now we are, I will explain a bit more to you what is the next steps on the Nature Restoration Law, which is all the implementation. It's starting with the planning, and most of the work that we're doing currently is about the national restoration plans, and I saw that in the conference there will be a lot of discussions on these plans. One thing to highlight is that on these plans, member states have full flexibilities for planning restoration. It's member states that have the best knowledge, but whether at a national level that there is the best knowledge on where, when, how to restore ecosystems. So member states decide which measures and where to achieve the targets. They will identify the areas needed, and they will set the satisfactory levels, and they will decide the timing for putting in place measures. So there is a full respect of the subsidiarity principle through this aspect. Through the planning, member states are encouraged to think restoration as an inclusive solution. I think the minister spoke about inclusive, science-based and effective solutions. I could change the title to reflect this view. Several aspects have been introduced in the nature restoration law to guide a bit how member states have to plan their efforts in a way to optimize the ecosystem contribution to sustainable development, while taking into account the diversity of situation in various regions, including the outmost regions. And above all, the planification aspects has to be an open, transparent, inclusive, and effective process, meaning that the general public, including all stakeholders, should be given early and effective opportunities to participate to the preparation. So by no means it should be a top-down approach, but everyone and all of you should be associated to the planning of restoration measures in your member states. Several synergies have been also highlighted for guiding and prioritizing the restoration investments. Again, climate, land degradation neutrality, disaster prevention, but also agriculture and forestry, so with the productive sectors, and of course, the synergies with other member states, because ecosystems don't know the human borderlines, so sometimes you need to act on the two sides of the same border. In terms of planning, we are under a short, tight schedule, because before the end of the year, we have to have prepared some draft implementing act to establish a uniform format and to put the draft at the table of the committee that will have to be created in the meantime. Then member states have 2 years to prepare the draft national restoration plan, first focusing on the actions up to 2030, but not only, they have also to depict, at least in a strategic overview, up to 2050. So it's really long-term planning. Then 6 months back to the Commission to do the assessment, 6 months to member states to reflect the observation that will be made by the Commission and finalize the plans. And the first revision, at least the first revisions, will be in 2032. So the nature restoration law is definitely not the end of the process, but rather the beginning of a new era, of a new adventure, while national restoration plans will start to be like keystone part for planning restoration efforts. An example of synergies with climate and other aspects can be found in one of these examples, so coming from the German Rhine rivers. It's an example of landscape restoration, where you can see also a lot of synergies between mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk prevention, and restoration. So by restoring the forest and the uphill, but also the wetlands, you are reducing the emissions, improving carbon removals, so you are contributing to EU climate law, to the LULUCF regulation. Some tools have been proposed for the individual actions through the carbon removal certificate framework. But you're also increasing the resilience of this landscape, so the sponge landscapes, which such landscape is much more resilient to droughts and floods. And that contributes to various objectives that have been introduced also in the climate law and in the adaptation strategy. So that's a concrete example, very visual, on what should look like restoration measures implemented by member states. Still with this view of breaking silos and ensuring consistency between various policies, the national restoration plans has to be connected with a lot of other policies, other plans. And I could say that the interaction is a bit twofold. It's not only these plans that will contribute to national restoration plans, but also the national restoration plans that in the near future will contribute to this one. And we're continuing to build a bit all these synergies and co-benefits among policies. So links have been established with the CAP strategic plans. The future soil monitoring law, the future forest monitoring law will also establish links with the national restoration plans. Will start to be quite an incontrovertible element of public action on biodiversity. Close links have been also established between among the various implementation tools of the NRL. So I've mentioned the national waste action plans, but this one will be also closely articulated to the monitoring obligations. And the monitoring obligations, they have to be started right now. It's when the text enters into force that member states have to start the monitoring obligation. There is also the reporting, and this reporting will be extremely important to be sure that the restoration measures are effective. And depending on the results of the monitoring and the reporting, member states may have the obligation to revise their national restoration plans if they are not fit for the it appears that they are not fit for reaching the objective. Let's go now to an important part of the Nature Restore Law, which is the restoration, the finance of restoration. Alors, a lot of persons are speaking about restoration costs, but instead of costs, I think the better view will be to consider that as an investment. Based on our analysis, each time that you spend €1 in restoring an ecosystems, on average, you have €8 back, especially in terms of provision of ecosystem services. According to our estimates, again, restoration financing needs, so to start the spending on restoration and receiving the investments, have been estimated to 6 to 8 billion per year in the EU. It looks like a huge figure, but when you're looking at the commitment made by member states in the current budget, the current multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, well, it's not so huge, meaning that 20 billion of euros have been unlocked for biodiversity every year, as from the Biodiversity Strategy 2030. It's covering protected areas, but also it can cover nature restoration. These 20 billion per year are reflecting in some earmarking targets, so 7.5% of the EU budget have to be dedicated to biodiversity for 2024, and this share has to be increased for 2026 and 2027. In terms of financing, the Nature Restoration Law opens also several possibilities, several opportunities for renewed support to restoration. One of the provisions encourages member states that they have the possibility to deploy private or public support schemes to the benefit of stakeholders. And next year, that's another deliverable by the Commission, we will have to produce a financial report to the Parliament and the Council, assessing the resources that are available for restoring nature, the needs, but the gaps of financing, and to make some proposal for adequate measures. So definitely the financing aspects will be also an important element for the near futures. And again, on that, we will need a lot of data, a lot of knowledge, a lot of inputs from the scientists and the practitioners community. Here is like a catalog of all the funds that are available, because I've just mentioned some figures. But here a bit the list of the EU funds that are available. So most of you know the LIFE program, and I saw coming here several posters about various LIFE projects. LIFE can indeed fund innovative projects with potential of replicability, especially across various member states. But LIFE program, and it is less known, can also fund support to member states in implementing the nature restoration law, including in designing, in planning, in preparing the national restoration plans. Another fund that is, I guess you're aware of, is Horizon Europe. There is also a lot of possibilities, and I will go to this part soon. But here also all the other funds that can be used to fund nature restoration. So there is the sectorial funds on fisheries and aquaculture, on agriculture, the regional development funds, the cohesion funds, also the recovery and resilience facility, so this new instrument that have emerged in 2020 after the pandemic. InvestEU, it's another way also for blended finance and to start using also the private investments. Of course, member states have national budgets, national funds, and the stated schemes have been renewed in a way to facilitate the funding of nature restoration. There is also some new mechanisms of public-private investments. So that's all the world of the sustainable finance and the corporate sustainability reporting obligations. So we have started to work on a taxonomy of economic activities. Don't be afraid, we like to use some words in different contexts, so taxonomy for you may be different. But in the Commission, the taxonomy refers to the classification of activities, of economic activities, and how to ensure that they can be sustainable activities. Two activities are already available in terms of environmental protection and restoration activities, especially the restoration of wetlands. And also in forestry, there have been a lot of technical screening criteria that have been proposed on how to better frame the funds for these activities. All that can contribute to funding nature restoration. Alors, I think that you will be more interested with the Horizon Europe, as it's the main funding instrument for the EU in terms of research. Already in the previous program, so Horizon 2020, there have been some earmarking on biodiversity-related research, and there have been a Green Deal call that has passed in 2020, which includes various call of projects on ecosystem restorations, up to 72 billion euros. So that's under this call that projects like Waterlands, Merlin, Superb have been funded. The current program, Horizon Europe, the main envelope for restoration is under the Cluster 6 on food, bioeconomy, natural resources, especially the destination, biodiversity and ecosystem services. You can see that there have been a strong increase of the funding available from 72 to more than 200 million for the last 2 years. There is also some opportunities of cooperation under the missions, like a Soul Deal for Europe, Restoring Oceans and Waters. Some co-funded partnerships, and several of you are present in the launching event of the Biodiversa Plus Biodiv Restore Knowledge Hub, which is a partnership between the Commission, Member States and other public organizations. Other partnerships are available in terms of agroecology, and a new one is under preparation on forest. In total, there is more than 400 million of EU fund that is available for research on biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And it's covering a bit the whole spectrum of activities. So through Horizon Europe, there is some possibilities for you to receive funding to document the biodiversity decline, but also to look at the nature-based solutions, to work on the ecosystem services, to work on improving the articulation between the productive sectors and biodiversity, especially in nature restoration. So in a way, how nature restoration can improve agriculture, can improve forestry, can improve fisheries, etc. All the transformative change, so how to ensure a world-to-society transition and mobilization for reversing biodiversity loss. Some aspects related to the connection and the coordination activities. And last but not least, because we're still in this context of the pandemic of COVID that has strongly highlighted the links between biodiversity and health, there is also some aspects related to this one. That is my last slide. Now, usually it's quite short, just say thank you and open to questions. But for once, I will take more time on this one. I think that you, the scientific community and the practitioners, well, you have your footprint and your fingerprints in every part of the text. And since, you could say even before the inceptions of the idea of the nature restoration law, so most of you have invested a lot of your time, a lot of your efforts to raise the topic of nature restoration. We can see now, and compared with 14 years ago, that there is much more success in this conference, which is also a signal of your success in highlighting the political importance of nature restoration. As it has been said, it's just the beginning of a new adventure, and there will be work for you for the next decades. So let's keep in touch, and let's continue to work together. Thank you. Tanan.
Thank you so much, Florian. Now we have opportunity for questions. There are two people with mics here, and they can quickly get it to you. The first question is here. Yes, thank you.
My name is Volker Maufer. I'm Austrian and very proud on Minister Gewessler, who made it possible that we all are here now on this topic. And I'm also a former coordinating leader of the Global Assessment, Chapter 6 of IPBES, so I'm happy to hear that it was helpful for you. You mentioned, and thank you for all the efforts of the Commission put into this topic for many years. I know you have many wind against you, or much wind against you, so thank you for standing strong. My question is, you mentioned that the restoration law is complementary and built upon the existing legislation, and I'm a member of the SERE legal working group, who has, by the way, in the Heard room afterwards the legal session. So I just wonder, you mentioned also renewable energy projects have certain exemptions outside of Natura 2000. And according to the Habitats Directive, even if a project is outside of Natura 2000, if it has potential significant effects on the Natura 2000 sites, it should be assessed under the appropriate assessment. And I just wonder in how far this now perhaps has an effect on the Habitats Directive, which we perhaps all don't want, and in general, in how far were there efforts to weaken the Habitats Directive also in the preamble of the restoration law, because when I first looked on it, I got sometimes the impression that there are quite some efforts to reinterpret the Habitats Directive by means of the direct applicable nature restoration law. So thank you.
Okay, so yeah, indeed, I saw that there have been there will be a legal sessions on that. So happy to further discuss on the details. Just to mention on this derogation, the so-called derogation, it was pretty much aligned with the Renewable Energy Directive and the way that it has amended the Nature Directives. Basically, it confers to the renewable energy projects a presumption of overriding public interest. And in some cases, especially if there is a strategic environmental assessment or an environmental impact assessment, it can also facilitate the obligation of having alternative tests. So it's a way for member states to facilitate the deployment of renewable energy projects. And there was a need to conciliate a bit that to secure the nature restoration law, as there were a lot of concerns expressed on the fact that on the permitting processes especially, the Habitat and Nature Directives and the Nature Restoration Law could activate some bugs on and could prevent the acceleration of the renewable energy that is much needed in our world now. Things being said, during the process we received support from alliances between NGOs and environmental NGOs and companies. So in mind a paper, for example, of Electric, that on the contrary have highlighted all the synergies that can happen between renewable energy and nature restoration. So there have been some concrete examples, for example, on how the offshore windmills can help to restore habitat of species of fish, for example, but also the marine habitats. Examples also on the solar panels, well, by doing green roofs, you can also improve the efficiency of solar panels. So there is still some work to do in terms of pedagogy, in terms of dissemination of knowledge and so on, to convince member states that you can do the two things together. And even in a perspective of climate change and climate mitigations, you need to act on the two sides. You need to improve the renewable energy, of course, but you need also to restore the natural things. And you saw that when we are losing 35% of our things in the last 15 years, there is also a strong climate argument for the restoration. So let's see if with all these signals, we will manage to avoid too much tensions between the two objectives and rather focus on the synergies. And we will help with guidance to interpret all that.
Thank you. There is a question back there.
Hi, Florian. Thanks a lot for the super informative presentation. But I check your timeline, and I have the feeling that we are again on the path of having a really tight schedule and not focusing probably on the quality of the results of this process. Do you think that is realistic, the timeline that you showed? And do you have the feeling that this will not impair the outcome of the restoration law and the implementation of it?
Well, one thing I could say on that is that for sure member states should not wait for the finalization of the national restoration plans to start the restoration measures. The first objectives have to be met by 2030. So if they wait For the final publication, at best in 2027, they will have only less than 3 years to reach this objective. So you're fully right that the planning processes have to be in parallel with the implementation of the first restoration measures, and above all the continuation of the ongoing one, as well as the implementation of non-deterioration measures. So by no means the planning processes has to be interpreted as, well, we have some time before acting on the ground. No, there is a need to act immediately. And you're fully right that we need to start, well, now, well, already the last 10 days.
Thank you.
Thank you. There.
Thank you very much. I'm Eugene Simonov from Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Work Group. And thank you, Florian, for the very detailed and broad at the same time picture, but it looks it's mostly relates to member states. And as NGOs active in accession states, we would be very much interested in how we can use the same legislation in the accession states to urge governments and non-governmental actors to pursue restoration in line with European goals and get help for all these wonderful European institutions.
Okay. Well, already in the provisions, so I've not spent too much time on that, but there is some consideration of the action or inaction of third countries on how to reflect that in the national restoration plans. There is also this aspect of cross-border cooperation that can cover the other countries. But I would prefer to insist on the fact that now that the EU has this nature restoration law, it's a contribution also to the global commitment, and it will be a bit the EU proposal that can be discussed with all other countries as part of this international fora and regional cooperation. Other example, for example, with the environmental agencies, they have already this kind of EUNet network, which is also involving knowledge and expertise with neighborhood countries. Well, there will be also the possibility to exchange best practices and be able to work together. Well.
Thank you. There is...
Thank you very much for your presentation. Given that ecosystem services, many of them are emergent at very large scale, my question is related to the cumulative impact assessment of many restoration projects. So the plans, the national plans, will be subject to strategic environmental assessment to look for the connection between particular projects. This is one question. And the second, because some ecosystem services characterize large catchments, like, for instance, Danube, right? Will be some connection between the national plans, informal, or to look for the consequences at catchment, large catchment scale? Thank you.
I think it will depend on the content of the national restoration plans. The strategic environmental assessments is triggered depending of the activities that you're implementing. So if, for example, to restore semi-natural grasslands, you need to cut down a large part of forest, in this case, it can trigger the necessity of a strategic environmental assessment. So there is no clear yes or no answer to this question. It's whether, when looking at the content of the national restoration plans, that member states will be able to assess if there is a need to conduct a strategic environmental assessment. And of course, well, I'm always speaking about member states, but the Commission will continue to support member states. So if there is some questions at the moment where member states, based on the proposed content of the national restoration plans, are asking the advice from the Commission, the legal advice, of whether or not they should start a strategic environmental assessment, then we will start also a dialogue process to be sure that member states are also doing it in the right way. On the catchment aspects, I think that whether yes, when you're looking at the content of the national restoration plans, it's really much in the spirit of these planning processes to look a bit on how to optimize the function of the ecosystems to the relevant communities and territories. So that's completely covered this aspect of the catchment areas. Another aspect also the interlinkages that has to be, or the interplay to be established between the national waste action plans and the river basins management plans. A lot of synergies are also to be established on this one.
Thank you. I would take one more question, but Florian will stay with us throughout the week, throughout the conference, so you always have the opportunity to go and ask directly about any concerns or aspects. Do we have more questions for? Everyone is so satisfied, it seems. I am very, very happy that you agreed to come. We have also a small present to you, which is the Estonian a book about Estonia from the swallows view. So. Flying above and looking down of Estonia's landscapes. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And,
I will put it.
This talk. And this one as well.
Thank you. I will put the book in evidence in the office so that when you come by Brussels, feel free to drop a message to me or the rest of the team, and we'll be glad to share a beer or coffee or some chocolate with you. Thank you very much for your listening, your attention, and let's work together this week and in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.